Hello, everyone. I hope you're all doing good. Yeah, so welcome to our today's session. Yeah, so I hope you're all doing well. So, on today, we'll be having a session on fusion development. And before that, I'd just like to take us through what we've been learning. So, today we are on our eighth session of the Game of Learners Power Platform Clinic, our seventh session, really. Yeah, on the Game of Learners Power Platform Clinics. So, this is our last week and I hope we are all excited about that. So yeah, so what is a game of learners per platform clinic? So this has been a 5 week upskill initiative with the per platform user group Kenya, and we've been having different sessions where we were learning on different technologies on Power Platform. So we had an introduction to low code development, app development using low code and no code, artificial intelligence in Power Platform. We had also automation using low code and no code, data analysis in Power Platform, building websites using low code, and now today we'll be doing fusion development. And I hope you are all excited. And yeah, I believe you're going to learn a lot. See on your screen, aka.ms.gol Power Platform. That's where you'll get resources to learn about Power Platform and what we've been doing. And also, you can learn on your own through this self-paced learning collection in the second link, aka.ms/GOL Power Platform Challenge. So, yeah, I hope you're all excited. And just like to encourage us to share your story online. You can tweet on what you've been learning. You can also post on your LinkedIn and also Facebook. You can use the Power Platform Clinics hashtag. Yeah, so yes. So today, as I said earlier on, we'll be learning on fusion development. And yeah, so if you have any questions, if you just have anything that you'd like to ask our speaker of today, anything that you'd like to know about fusion development, you can just ask at the chat section. And yeah, we'll get back to you. So, I'd like to introduce our speaker of today, Julia Mwiruri, who's a cloud advocate at Microsoft. Yes, welcome, Julia.
Thank you so much, Luke. Could you just confirm if you're able to hear me okay?
Yes, you're audible.
Perfect. Thank you. Hi everyone. As you've heard, my name is Julia Mwiruri, and I work at Microsoft as an academic cloud advocate. So what that basically means is that I stand in between Microsoft and the student developer community to help students as well as educators get onboarded with Microsoft tools and offers. So in terms of my focus area, I focus a lot on Microsoft Cloud as well as low and no code, that is the Power Platform and Fusion development, which we would be talking more about in today's session. So these are my social media handles on Twitter and LinkedIn. In case you'd want to connect, in case you'd want to consult on anything, I'm more than happy to help. So with that, I guess I'll just get straight into today's presentation, which is around fusion development. And for the agenda, what we have lined up, the first thing is that we'll introduce what fusion development is. I know this is a pretty new term, so I'll try and expound more in terms of what we mean by fusion development and also talk about why you should learn it. Then we'll also talk about something called the Power Apps Component Framework. We'll also talk about custom connectors and do a demo on how you can create a custom connector and then use it in a Power Platform, in a Power Automate. And then lastly, we'll have a try it yourself exercise where we'll talk about an opportunity for you to actually try out what we'll have covered in today's session on your own. So what I'll also have is your questions that you'll actually put on the chat will be part of my agenda. So towards the end, I'll try and respond to all the questions that you'll have shared on the chat. So kindly feel free to post in your questions and comments on the chat, and we'll be able to address them. So the first thing we'll do basically is try and introduce what fusion development means. So in case you've heard this term before, you might be familiar that this is actually the intersection between pro developers. And by pro developers, I basically talk about anyone who has an engineering or a computer science background, someone who is familiar with the development concepts. So that would be a code first or a pro developer. And then we have that intersection with citizen developers as well. So what citizen developer basically means is someone who doesn't have any coding background, but is interested in leveraging technology in their specific fields. So for example, you might be doing law, and there is a lot that can actually be done in the law field using technology. So you just want to get some skills and see how you can bring in technology in your own specific field. And the good news here is that Power Platform is not just for developers, but it's actually everyone's platform. That means that if you have no coding experience, there is room for you where you can actually use drag and drop components like a similar experience to what you have on PowerPoint to actually build apps, to create reports, and we've covered that in the previous sessions throughout this series. And then if you have some little understanding of coding concepts, you can also come in and use some level of code. So that is why it's also called the low code, where you can also have an option to just write a little bit of code, which is a lot like the Excel like formulas that we are all familiar with. And then finally we have the code first persona. That would be anyone with an engineering background. You can actually bring in your professional skills and have a role to play in the Power Platform. So as you can see on this image, this is actually how a fusion team comes in. And frankly speaking, I would say that most companies are embracing this approach to creating development teams. What do I mean by this? Today's development teams doesn't just comprise of those people that can write actual code, but it also comprises, as you can see on this image, let me just try and get a laser pointer. As you can see on this image, we have someone who is let's say conversant with a field. So this person is talking about how can we actually automate a process like part checks. And then we have someone who is an office manager who actually agrees to the fact that they can start the automation, and it would be ideal for the office manager. And then we also have an inventory manager here who is familiar with the Power Platform. They're able to build Power Apps without having to write, code. And so that's the citizen developer part of this team. And then on the other part, we have the pro developers. So in this case, we have let's say a full stack developer who is actually able to build an API to help this team to be able to access the goal that they want. And then we also have an IT system admin who could also help in extending the functionality of the Power App that will be created. So ideally, a fusion team is that intersection between citizen developers, people with no coding experience, with the pro developers, and they actually work together to build customized tech solutions that will be useful in their organization. So in the next slide, we'll briefly talk about why this is actually a skill that is worth learning about. So let me just a second. Yeah. So this slide briefly just talks about why you need to understand the fusion concept. And so from a developer's perspective, the reason why you should actually learn about this is because number one, Power Platform is actually growing at a significant rate. And traditional developers are now starting to have that interest in learning how can they, get started within the Power Platform. and they don't really have to give up their years of experience with writing code, working with APIs, ALM, and any other professional concept. But in turn, they would actually bring in those concepts and have that expand the capabilities of Power Platform, which you can see is the second reason why they should do that. Simply because Power Platform itself, in case it has any limitations, it's very much possible to go beyond those limitations using code. And then from a citizen developer's perspective, you would actually learn about fusion development, because this is the key for you to go beyond the limits that may come with the Power Platform. So I'll give an example that you can see here on the screen. So we do have a Microsoft student ambassador who's called Rachel, and she went on Twitter and just asked that, there was no trigger for Reddit on Power Automate. And then her question was it possible to actually create one? And then on this screenshot, you can see that we have Jocelyn Panchal, who is a program manager here at Microsoft, who was able to pick up this tweet and also acknowledge that at that time, the Reddit connector was not in existence. And so her response was that that would actually be created. And as you can see on this other side, we can now see a pull request that has been created by one developer who is actually going to create a Reddit connector to allow Rachel to now achieve whatever she wanted to achieve on the Power Platform. So this is what I mean by fusion development, allowing you to go beyond the limitations of the Power Platform. In case you're trying to do something on a Power Platform and you realize that you don't have, the necessary features to do that, there's a lot of, opportunity to have pro developers come in and build out a customized format of exactly what you need to do. So in this next slide, we're going to talk about one of the ways in which developers can come in to extend the functionality of the Power Platform. So for today's session, today's is just an hour long. So we're going to briefly look at two ways in which, for you as a professional developer, you could actually embrace this way and start creating components or just build out tools that can be utilized by the global audience of citizen developers. And this first approach is through the creation of Power Apps custom components. So for a minute, let me just pause there. And I know that probably this is something totally new, so you might wonder, what exactly am I talking about? So when you're talking about Power Apps component framework, think of it in the sense that Power Platform currently has a limited number of out-of-the-box features that can be utilized. So I'll briefly go to my browser and just show you exactly what I mean. And so at this point, you would see that I'm currently on Power Apps. So Power Apps is basically the makerspace where citizen developers come in here, they build out their low-code solutions. And as you can see, I have a sample app here. So this is the application that I use for my own demos. And if I go to the Insert tab at the top, I can actually see the different options that I have in terms of components that I can add to my application, right? So these are the top popular. I could add some input controls. I could as well add some display controls. I can add some layout controls. So if I want to visualize my components in a vertical gallery or a horizontal gallery, and then I can also add media. But you can see that the list is actually not as large. Probably you might have a company that wants to have a more customized feel in terms of the controls that they're using. So you'd see that at this point, you have that form of limitation with the Power Platform. So as a developer, you can actually come in to build custom code components. So you can see on this picture that we have some of the controls. So you can opt to visualize a list in form of a map. So that is currently not provided as an out-of-the-box service on Power Platform, but as a developer, you can actually go out of your way and build such a component using a language like TypeScript or even JavaScript, and then you can deploy it to be utilized by citizen developers within your environment. So when we're talking about the Power Apps component framework, this basically is a framework just like any other framework that you might be familiar with. Talk of React, talk of Angular. This is a framework that allows you to build custom code components that you can as well deploy to a Power Platform environment and have users, and have citizen developers use them in their own applications. So right now, if I go to my browser, you'd actually see that we have a PCF gallery. So this is basically some of the samples that developers have been kind enough to actually create and provide in this repository, so that any local developer would actually come in here and pick a control that they would be interested in utilizing. So you can see that we have someone who created a glowing text control. So as a citizen developer, you can come into this gallery, you can easily pick this control and use it in your own application. And you can see the list is very, very long. So we have very many custom controls that have been created. And you might wonder, if this is what I want to do, where do I actually get started? So we do have a repository on GitHub. Under Microsoft organization, we do have the Power Up samples. All this is open source, so that means you can basically just create a custom control and deploy it here. So I would briefly just talk through how the steps would be for you ideally. So I have this cloned and I have this open on my Visual Studio. So the example that I'm going to show us is from my slide. Just a second. From my slide, you would actually see that this is an example of a custom control that has been created. So this person decided to provide a control where I can feed it my latitude and longitude coordinates, and it would be able to actually show, a visual on the map. So how would this person actually go around creating such a control and making it available for citizen developers across the world to use it? So I have this opened on my Visual Studio Code. And as you can see, the very first step would be to you to actually initialize your control just like any other control. So what you would need for this is you would need an extension that has been created called the Power Apps tools. So we have the Power Platform tools. Yep. So the Power Platform tools would be the extension that you would need to be able to create this on your own. Let me just zoom in a little bit more. And then you'd realize that once you install this extension, it's actually going to have, just a second, this is just too big from my end. You'd actually have the Power Platform command line available on your VS Code terminal. And this is how you'd be able to interact with Power Platform directly from Visual Studio Code. So that's the other beauty about Fusion development. As a developer, you don't have to work away from your favorite development tools, but rather all these capabilities have been provided in a tool that you use on a day-to-day basis. And so I would go back to my file. And at this point, so since I'm not creating this control from scratch, you'd actually realize that you would use a command to actually create this control. And then once you do that, it's going to initialize a bunch of files for you. So it's going to generate a manifest file for you, a file that would actually basically just contain the metadata for your control. So it will provide the name, the description, if it's a required value input on the Power Platform. So you would be able to define all that data from from the manifest file. And then it's also going to auto-generate a TypeScript file that will automatically come with 4 methods. So before that, let me just run this project. Let's see how that experience would be like for you. And so at this point, let me just zoom out a little bit. So at this point, I'm on my terminal and I'm in the PCF demo directory. And what I can do is that I can just get into the iframe control directory just for you to see what this control actually does and how the creator got to this point. So I would actually now type in a command as any other. So I would just do an npm start. And remember, this is actually the exact experience you have while you're creating, your React application. So it's not really too steep of a learning curve. So I'll also type in the watch command so that every time I make updates on my file, it's automatically going to be watching my terminal, and it's going to reflect that on the browser. So I'm just going to hit enter, and it's going to start my project. It's going to load it on the browser. And once that completes, you would see that I actually power up the Power Platforms, the Power Apps Component Framework test environment. So you can see that it's a lot similar to what you actually do with your day-to-day applications. You can as well inspect your code on the browser. And then this is just like to test out how this code component would look like once it's deployed on the Power Platform. So it will allow a user to input their latitude value and their longitude values, and it would be able to load up a map. So this is actually what the control does. And as you can see, once you initialize this project, automatically 4 methods will be created in your TypeScript file. So the first method is going to be the init method, which if I expand, you would see that this is actually just the entry point for your control. So you would declare you would actually declare whatever you'd be using, like the controls you'll be using. So this is actually the method that you'd use for that. Then the other method that comes by default is the update view method. So in here, you would basically pass in the instructions, and it would actually receive the inputs that are provided and now make changes to the control that is being rendered to the audience and to the user. And then you would have the get outputs as well as the destroy methods being created for you automatically. You don't have to add any code to, let's say, the destroy method if you don't have any components that need to be removed after this control has been executed. But again, this is not limiting. You can also create your own method. So for example, you can see that this control actually introduces 2 extra methods where you can actually now pass in the instructions to create, to render a Bing map. So the iframe is actually bringing in a Microsoft Bing map. And then you can see where we're actually updating the URL with both the latitude and the longitude values that are passed by the user. So this ideally would be the experience that you'd have creating your own control. So this is just a sample, and you've seen that it's quite a lot similar to what you have already been doing with your other React apps. So because this is not today's main demo, I would leave it at that, but share that we do have some resources. So I did write a blog that would actually help you get started. So I believe this will be shared on the chat on how you can actually get started by building these custom controls using TypeScript. I've added some videos just to also help you in terms of the steps you would need to take. So I would just share this with you. And in case of any questions, again, you can always reach out. So that is the very first way that you can actually, contribute to the Power Platform by bringing in your development skills, by creating the custom code components, and this would make the experience a lot better for citizen developers. So if a company wants to have very customized controls, they would be able to get that assistance from a developer. Remember that citizen developers who don't have a coding background may not be able to make this happen, but with the creation of a Fusion development team, whatever the citizen developer cannot do, it's likely that the professional developer would be able to do. And again, just to wind up on the Power Apps component framework, all this is open sourced. We have documentation around how you can actually get started. So think of it as creating a project that would potentially have a global audience, because anyone can access these controls and be able to use them in their own individual business setups. So that's the first approach that you can use to contribute to the Power Platform using your coding experience. And then the second one would be through a concept we call connectors. So what basically are these connectors? And how I like to introduce connectors is that I'd like you to think of the Power Platform, which is a low-code development environment. And then I'd like you to also think about any other external service. So how would you access data that is sitting on an external service directly from the Power Platform? And that is with the use of connectors. So think of a connector being a wrapper around an API. So ideally, you would be using an API to access data from any other third-party or external service. And in this case, if you actually present endpoints, let's say you present endpoints to a citizen developer, they might not really know how to consume them and actually get access to the data. But with a connector, what that does is that it basically just wraps that API and it provides the same functionality, only that it's a very simplified manner that would actually help this citizen developer to access this third-party this third-party service. So mainly, another way to think of it is that it allows REST services to be able to talk to Power Platform. And by Power Platform, we mean Power Apps, Power Automate, as well as Logic applications. So that is just basically an introduction to what a connector is. And so that second approach that you could use is to build a connector to help citizen developers access external services, services that are not within the Power Platform. Now, we have different types of connectors. So we have 3 types of connectors, and these types are actually derived from the API availability, the owner of the underlying service, as well as the audience. So who can consume this connector? And the first type of connector that we have is called the custom connector. So what a custom connector is, number one, if you have an API and this API is either publicly or privately available, and then number two, it's not the service owner, so the underlying service which talks to this, which responds to this API, it could be that we have the connector, the developer of that service, or basically just anyone else actually creating this connector. But the distinction is that for a custom connector, it can only be used internally. So that means it has not been certified to be used by anyone outside that organization. So think of a business where you create a specific API customized for that business, and then you avail that custom connector to the internal developers, to the internal citizen developers, then that would be a custom connector. Now, the second type of connectors is the certified connectors. So it's a lot similar to the custom connector, only that you would actually certify it and have it publicly available. So I'll briefly talk about the certification process towards the end, how you can actually not just have your connector being used in an internal setup, but have it deployed to be used by anyone, in the world. And then the thing about certified connectors is that only the API owners can develop these type of connectors. So let's say you've created your own API, you can choose to create a connector for it, and then you can certify it. So you'll have it Microsoft certified, and everyone can now actually be able to connect to your API from the Power Platform. And then the third type of connector is the independent publisher connector, which will basically focus on for today's demo. And this is where we have a lot of community contribution. So I believe everyone on this call currently would be interested in having their development skills create a project that could be used by potentially citizen developers from any part of the world. So what you would do is that you would actually identify an API that is publicly available. So I know that if we have developers on this call, you've worked with tons of APIs. So you'd actually think about that API. And then if it's publicly available, you can opt to create a connector for it. So you would just do that, and then you would have it certified, and everyone else can now access to that API through the connector that you will have created. So those are the 3 types of connectors, and I believe you'll understand more about this as we continue with the presentation. I'll try and clarify anything that so far isn't as clear. So at the moment, we have over 800 connectors that are already available. So I'll just get to my browser once more. And then if you actually go to the connector documentation, so we have the connector documentation. Let me just zoom in a little bit. So we have the official connector documentation. You would be able to access a list of all the connectors that are currently available. As you can see, this list is very, very long, and it has been divided into 2. We have connectors that have been published by Microsoft. So if I click on that link, it's actually going to filter and bring back the connectors that have been created by Microsoft. So this one would actually allow the Power Platform to talk to external services. And so we do have quite a bunch of them actually, and I'm not even familiar with some of these services, but you can see that there's no limit, in terms of the services that you can connect from the Power Platform. And then we have those that have been published by non-Microsoft. So this would be the API owners as well as community developers, just as yourself. And so this way you would actually see that we have some names that you might actually know. So these are basically community enthusiasts who are just interested in learning a new skill and building and also deploying connectors that can be accessed, by everyone. And so this is actually like the second bunch of connectors that are available. So you could actually browse through the connectors documentation, and then you would see the example of services that you can be able to access directly from Power Platform. So that's it about the connectors. So I guess at this point, we'll just get straight into our demo. And for today's demo, we are going to work with the Google Photos API. So if you're a developer, you would ideally, be contented if you're provided with the endpoints, for this API. You would be able to know how to work around your code to be able to access this data. But think of a citizen developer, someone with no coding background. How would they actually be able to connect to the same service, without having to worry about the underlying code? So for today's session, we're going to address that. We're going to build a connector for the Google Photos API, and then we are actually going to utilize it from a Microsoft flow. And so with that, I'm going to go back to my browser, and then so I'll just go to Power Platform. So you can go to make.powerapps.com, and then you will actually scroll to what we have what we call connectors. So on your left navbar, you would be able to see, we have the Home tab, we have the Create button. So once you scroll that, we have this icon that shows custom connectors. And then before we actually build the actual connector, let's look at the service we want to access. So I want to access my Google Photos account, and I want to enable anyone who is working from the Power Platform to be able to access this service directly without having to switch from application to the other. And so Google Photos now has its own API, and as you can see, I have the documentation up. So with this documentation, you would be able to understand, what are the methods that I can do, what are the operations that I can actually do on Google Photos. And then just like any other API, for you to access this API, you would need to create a client application. And I already have one so that I can get my client ID as well as my client secret. So I created my client application, and I have access to the credentials so that I authenticate to this service from Power Platform. Now, something else that is worth mentioning at this point is that a connector, and this has been a question that most people ask, is that if you create a connector, does it actually guarantee the safety of your data? And the answer is yes, simply because the connector will implement the API's authentication that has been enforced. So if an API requires you to authenticate, you would be required to actually do that via the connector. And you would see how we are going to configure that in the next couple of minutes. So with that, what I'm going to do is that I'm going to take an extra step, and I'm going to create a Postman collection. So you can see that I do have my collection, which has a bunch of methods. Let me just zoom in a little bit. I hope this is visible. So you can see that I do have my collection that has these 5 methods, and I'm going to quickly test. And if you're actually looking to create a custom connector, I personally love this method because it's very easy to get started. Once you have tested your endpoints on Postman, it becomes super easy to be able to replicate that success directly from Power Platform. So I have some 5 methods here. I'm going to check the list albums. So this is connected to my account, and as you can see, I have 2 albums. I have my food album as well as my Animalia album. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to come to my collection, to my Postman collection, and I want to test this. So I'm just going to send that. It's a get method. So this actually gives me a 401 error. So that means I need to re-authenticate to the service. I need to probably get a new access token. So let me try and do that. I've re-authenticated to the application. I've gotten a new access token that I can use, which has been added. And right now, if I send the request again, you'll see that it actually brings back my data. So it provides some information about the albums that I have. I have 2 albums. It will give me the ID. It will give me the title as well as some other information. So I have 2 albums here. And then let's say I want to create a new album, right? So I'll just also test this operation. We'll use the tool for this demo. So I'll come to my body. I need to provide a name for my album. So let's just say Cars. I'm also going to send that. And you'll see that it actually gets back with a 200 status code. That means that it has successfully created my new album. So if I refresh my Google Photos, I believe it should show that I have one additional album that has been created, that is the cars and the cars album. So that's okay. So what I'm going to do, this is the first step. I want to create a custom connector, right? So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to export this collection as is. So I'm going to just click on these ellipses and I want to export. So this would basically just create the JSON file with the definition for this, for this collection. And then I'm going to go back to Power Platform. And on the custom connectors, I'll say that I want to create a new custom connector. And something to note here is that you have several options on how you can begin creating your connector. You can choose to create it from blank. That would mean you would need to provide every single operation, manually. And then you can actually do it from an Azure service, which is currently in preview. You can import an Open API specification file, and this and Power Apps would be able to actually create a connector from that file. You can do the same with an Open API, but from a URL, and then you can use a Postman collection, which is what we're going to do for this demo. So I'm going to select that option, and then I'm going to give the connector a name. So I'll give it Joel Clinics demo. So let's give it Joel Clinics demo, GC demo, and then I'm going to import my file. So since I downloaded the file, I'm actually going to get it here. Remember, this platform will only accept a JSON file. So I've selected my file. Let me confirm if it's the right file. Yep. And then I'm going to hit continue. Then what's going to happen is that the Power Platform is actually going to take what we have in that file and try and create a connector from it. So you'll see that it borrowed the description that I had on that file, and then it was able to detect that the scheme we are using is HTTPS. And true to that, if I go back to my collection, you would see that that's actually the scheme that we are using. And then you would actually see that it was able to extract the host domain. So that's exactly what we are using as well. That is the photoslibrary.googleapis.com. And then we have the base URL. The next thing that we'll need to configure is security. So this was actually able to pick that we don't have any authentication, but that is not true because I would need to authenticate to this service. So I'm just going to change that to OAuth 2 because I know that this API utilizes that authentication method. So I'm just going to basically provide these details to be able to allow users to sign into their accounts using using the authentication method that has already been defined. So I'm going to quickly copy my client ID, which I already have because I created the client application. So I'm just going to copy that. And this is all confidential information, so I'll probably refresh this after the demo, but this is not information that you actually ship with the connector. This is just for you as you create your connector and as you test it out. So I've provided the client ID as well as the secret. I need to provide the authorization URL. So the beauty of Postman is that you actually have all this information ready for you to actually just copy and paste. So I do have the auth URL here that I can copy and just provide. So this is the URL that my user would actually be directed to begin the authentication into the service. I also need to provide a token URL because the service will require a token. And I'm going to simply use this token to authenticate successfully to the system. And then I'm also going to have that as the refresh URL because would need to refresh this token after a certain time frame. So I'll provide that as well. And then for the scope, now the scope basically is the level of access that you are giving your user. So from Postman, we also have that defined. So you can see for me to be able to create an album in my Google Photos account and to also list the album, I would need to have access to this level. So I'll just copy these scopes and paste them in here. And with that, I can now go to the next step, which is the definition. So we are going to simply define the actions, or rather what our users can now do with this connector. So in the interest of time, we are not going to do all these 5 operations. So I'm just going to delete this get media operation. I'll delete the list media items operation, and I'll also delete the get albums operation. So we'll have 2 operations. One will be able to list our albums. So from the Power Platform, a user would be able to list the albums that they have in their accounts. You can see that the description has been imported from our file. And so what I'm going to do is that I'm going to reduce the words that are being used. So this should be enough. So I'm just going to delete everything else that comes after. That's good to go. So you can see it already picked that this is a get request, and it already provided the request URL. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to give it a sample for this connector to sort of understand what sample, what sample response will it actually be getting. So I'll do that for the response. And you'd see that if I go back to my Google Photos, so it's the list album operation. You can see that this is a sample, a response that it would be able to get from the API. So I'm just going to copy that and I'm going to paste it here. So I'm going to say that I want to import from a sample. This is the body and I'm going to import. And you'll clearly see that it was able to pick up the specific fields that I'm going to be receiving from my data, right? So the data will come with these fields. It has been able to pick them up and it has added as expected outputs. And then for my create album method, I'm also going to reduce the amount of words that have been used to describe it. I think I'm okay with everything. For the create album, the body will actually our request will have a body. So I can actually also provide a sample for it. So I can just come back to my postman, and for the create album, I can actually just provide a response as well. So I'm just going to copy it. So let's just add a sample for our response. I'm going to import from sample. I'm going to paste it there and import. And it's also going to indicate that it's going to receive these 4 fields from the connector. So with that, I'm just going to say that I want to create the connector. I've confirmed the action. So far, my connector will only allow users from the Power Platform to list the albums in their Google Photos account, as well as create a new album. So you can think of several use cases where you would want your local users to actually be able to interact with, a service like Google Photos. Remember, this could be any service. Just for purposes of this demo, we're going to work with that. And then the last thing we're going to do is that we're going to test this. So we're going to see if this actually works, right? So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to create a new connection. So a connection basically is you authenticating into the underlying service. So in this case, we would need to authenticate to Google Photos API, to Google Photos. So I'm just going to do that. I'm going to create a new connection. And since we used OAuth 2, I believe it should be able to allow us to sign in using our your Google account. So that has been created. And if I scroll down, let me just zoom in. You'd see that at the very bottom here, I have a new connection that has been created 2 seconds ago, and the status is that I have been connected. So that was successful. If it does not succeed in creating that connection, it would actually have the same output, but this wouldn't be connected. So you would be prompted to fix your connection. So I'm going to go back to custom connectors, and then we would see the connector that we have just created. So we'll give it a quick second to load. So we have our GC demo. I'm going to click the edit button, and then I'm going to navigate to the test operation. And so from here, I can see that I have already created a connection, and I do have access to my 2 operations. So the first operation was, can I actually list the albums that are available in my Google Photos account? Let's test and see if that has been created. So it's going to take a couple of seconds. And if you get a green check mark, that means the test has been successful and that your request has actually brought back some data. So you can see that this is the header that was sent and this is the body. So this is actually the data that we got back from the API. You can see I have my 3 albums. So I have the first album being food, I have the second being animalia, and I have the third being cars. Then let's test this second operation where we want to create an album directly from Power Platform. So we have two options. You can choose to do it this way, where you just type in the name of your album, or you can actually switch to provide the raw code. So you could actually have those two options. So in this case, I'm just going to type in the name. So I'm just going to call it GOL Clinics Photos. So let's say I want to create an album for this series. So if I can test the operation, we'll see if that succeeds. And if it succeeds, again, we'll get a green check mark, and you'll see the status of your response, of your request, and then you'd actually get the body back. So it has created the GOL Clinics Photos album, and it also returns the ID as well as this other information. So at this point, what you've done is that you've taken an external service that before wasn't available from the Power Platform, and then you've created a connector to wrap that API. And then in this format, you'd be able to present it for it to be used by low-code developers. So for the last bit of this demo, what we're going to do is that we're actually going to use this from a Power Automate. So let's say we're going to configure a flow that is actually going to execute this task, and it's going to actually utilize this connector to talk directly to Google Photos. So I'm just going to go to make.powerautomate.com and access Microsoft Flow. I'll give it a quick second to load. And again, if you have any questions, please just feel free to have them on the chat. We'll try and address as many as I can. So I just want to access Power Automate. I hope this picks the right environment. All right, so unfortunately, this is the wrong environment. So let me just. Okay, so let's try and do it from Power Apps. Or I could try and log into Power Automate again. So let me sign in to Power Automate. I'm going to sign in. I just need to ensure that I use the correct credentials. Sorry, it automatically picks my work email. I need to sign out. So I'm going to sign in with the developer account. And if you're actually wondering how do you get started, you can sign up for a free M365 developer account that will allow you to interact with the Power Platform, similar to what I'm doing without having to pay for these services. So it's a free offer. So I would actually have that link on the chat. So I'm just authenticating on my phone to be able to access my account. And I think that's done. Let's see if I'm in the right environment. Just give it a quick second. Okay, yeah, so it still picks my work email. So we won't use Power Automate, but I can access Power Automate from Power Apps. So let's just try and create a new flow from here. Let's see if that's going to work. I'm going to create it from blank. So at this point, I'm just creating a flow that is going to utilize my connector just to see if it's going to work. And this is going to pick Power Apps as the trigger, but let's just see if it's going to work. I'll confirm I'm in the right environment. Okay, yeah. So this is the other thing that you need to be cautious about. You can see that I was creating my connector in Julia Muiruri's environment. So once I come to Power Apps, I need to ensure that I am in the exact same environment. So I'm just going to switch the environment. I'm going to go to Power Automate. Let's try and access Power Automate from here. The demo codes seem to be working extra hard today. So let's see if this works. Yeah, so for some reason we will get some errors with Power Automate, but let's just try and build it from here. So we'd go to flows. I would create a new flow. I would have it as an instant flow, and I would give it a name demo. I would manually trigger this, and then I will hit create. So we want to see, will our data really be accessible from Power Automate? So I'm going to create a step here that is going to utilize a custom connector. And you can see the list of custom connectors that I have currently in my environment. So the one that we just created is the GC demo, which I'm going to select. And then you can see that we have two actions. So our users can either create the album or list the album. So at first, let's first list the albums that we have. So we don't need to provide any details. So you'll see that I just need to save this flow and then test it to see if it's actually going to connect us to our data. So I'm going to say that I want to test this. I'll test it manually, and then I will be prompted to sign into my service. So I guess I can add a new connection. And if it signs this incorrectly, you'll find this green check mark. Then I'll hit continue and I'll run my flow. So if everything has been configured correctly, the flow should run and you'll see whether it runs successfully or if it fails. In this case, it has run successfully. And you can see that from Power Automate, we've been able to set up a flow that has listed the albums that we have. So you can see that I already have access to my data, and you could actually view this, you could actually download this and just view the data that you have access to. So the same case, we can as well add a new action. Let's delete this. Let's try creating an album from Power Automate. So I'm going to come to my custom code. I'm going to select the control that I want to use. Sorry, the connector that I want to use. I want to create an album. So in this case, you'd see that we are presenting this in a way that is very easy for a local developer to interact with the API. Instead of providing them with endpoints or code, you're actually having this as the user interface. So in this case, I can have a title called demo photos. Then I can just save my connector. And once that happens, I'll just test it, and I'll test it manually. I'll run my flow, and then it's going to load up and see whether I've be able to create my album directly from Power Automate. So you can see that that happened successfully. I created an album with this as the title, and this is the response that I get back. So I will get my ID, I get my title, I get my product photos, my product URL, as well as a Boolean value on whether it's writable or not. So you can see that this is a lot similar to the response that you would be receiving from Postman, that is from a developer's perspective. And then I would basically be able to have my users from the Power Platform be able to interact with the Google Photos account. So if I can hit refresh, I'll see that I do have a couple of more albums that have been created, and I've done this directly from Power Platform. So that's basically just how that experience would be. So at this point, I do know that as a developer, you can already think of how you can actually bring in your skills to create such services. And we have a lot of available APIs that are publicly available with no connectors created. And so at that point, I'm just going to go back to my slides. And so in case you're really interested in building such a connector, so remember you would be identifying a service that is yet to be made accessible from the Power Platform. The product team has actually published a list called the Top Connector Asks. So these are connectors that community members are really asking for. So as a developer, you could actually come here. I believe this link will be shared on chat. You can grab one of the services that is there, access the API, build a connector for it, and then have it certified to have, global users use it. And then if you're interested in really taking this project up, I do have a blog that I've shared in terms of how you can build an independent publisher connector as a capstone project. So I believe that you can also share a link to that blog. It has all the consolidated resources that you would need to actually build this. And then you can actually access it at aka.ms/custom connector guide. If you go to that URL, you should be able to load up that guide. And then lastly, we have our Code First developers in the Power Platform LinkedIn group. So if you're also interested in joining a community with other developers trying to do the same thing, that is extend the Power Platform using their coding expertise, you can be able to also access this group. And yeah, we'll basically be there to help guide and unblock in case of anything. Then lastly, as I wind up, we do have some of the tools that you would be using potentially to create these connectors. We have the Pacon CLI. So with Pacon, basically you'd be able to download your connector. And in case you want to also have that ALM story, so you also want to have multiple versions of your connector, you would be able to access this directly from VS Code. So you'd basically install Pacon. You can install it using the command pip install pacon. Of course, you would need to have Python installed, and then that would make it accessible from VS Code. You can log into your account and then download your connector, be able to make updates on it, and then submit it on GitHub. And then the second tool is that we have the Power Platform Connectors extension that I briefly talked about towards the beginning of the presentation, which can also help you interact with your Power Platform environment. And I believe that's it. So in terms of what you expect, so should you be interested in building a connector, the first step would be for you to identify an API. Remember, it needs to be publicly available if you want to create an independent publisher connector. If you're the creator of the API, you basically just need to create a connector, just as we've done for your own API. And then it's optional for you to now have it submitted on GitHub. So we have our own repository. So I'll briefly share that with you, where you can submit your connector. Actually, let me just show you the repo. So this would be, okay. So let's see if we can access it here. So the repo is Power Platform Connectors. And you would see that we actually have 3 folders here. So if you're just a community contributor, you can actually have a connector that will go in this folder, and everyone will be able to now access your connector from here. So from this repo, they get deployed to the Power Platform and end up on this site. So again, it will be nice to have your name appear on one of the Microsoft products. It's equally good for your own portfolio. And I think with that, I'll wrap up the presentation. So these are also some of the resources that you can utilize if you want to use more of your development skills with the Power Platform. So we have this Reactor survey link that would really appreciate if you could share your feedback about this session, how we can improve, and as well as the content. And yeah, so thank you for your time. Luke, I don't know if you have any questions for me.
So thank you so much, Julia. The session has been really amazing. Learned a lot. Yeah. So there are no questions from the chat. Yeah. So I think you have tackled it really well, and I'm sure a question that has been asked many times in tech events is whether no code or low code is a threat to development, and I'm sure you've tackled it really well. And from your presentation, we've seen that pro developers can work together with citizen developers to build amazing software. So thank you so much, Julia. Yeah. So yeah.
Right. No worries. Thank you, Luke, for having me. But in case of anything, again, you can always reach out. I shared my social media handle. So, yeah, happy to connect.
Yeah, so if you would like to learn more on fusion development, so you can just go to aka.ms/gol per platform clinics. There are learning modules on Microsoft Learn where you can learn more about fusion development. So yes, so if you like to builder connectors and everything that Julia has said. I'm sure you can learn more about it in the MS Learn. So we'll be having the last session. So as we stated earlier on, this is part of our series. So we are on our 7th session. So next, it's actually this week, 2nd of March, we'll be having another session on creating low-code mixed reality apps with Power Apps. So I hope we'll all be there. So yes, so it's on 2nd March. So I think that's all. Les, Julia, you have anything else to add?
Not really, Luke. I think I'm all good on my end. Thanks so much
Okay.
for the moderation.
Yeah, thank you also for the presentation. I think we can wrap it up. Yeah,
Cool.
so goodbye, everyone. Yeah.
Thank you. Bye.